Wednesday had lived a very, very long time. There was a time where she wasn't so macabre. The place she once dwelt wasn't one of pain and agony but one of light and comfort. A new place was made, a place that could exist in both darkness and light, forever in tandem, in harmony, a dance that would be eternal. The light and the dark in a courtship that would last till the end of the age of starlight. And then they came. Humanity. There was a war, a rebellion. It was in her nature to rebel, to defy the supreme authority even if that authority could wipe her out with a mere thought. She would not submit tamely and bow down before this plague, much less to love them more than the supreme authority. She had declared to herself before the age of starlight had begun that she could not love, she would not love, it was unbecoming of her. For her defiance, as well as those of her rebellious kind, they had been hurled down into the waiting abyss, a seascape of fire and sulphur. Her kind of world, where torment and agony were around every corner, and then the humans started to arrive in their millions, having been deemed by the supreme authority to not be worthy or deserving of the light of the eternal realm. Her only grievance was that her raven-colored wings had been stripped of their golden ebony feathers, leaving only the skeletal remains in their wake. They always unfurled when her knives glittered as they were about to begin her work. Her pleasure. Those that had ended up there deserved it, that much was clear. Their lives had been spent hurting others, for selfish gain or revenge. Wednesday quickly claimed her spot as the starlightless realm's best and most infamous torturer. Her skill with all manner of blades was both revered and feared. Some humans were so dark and twisted that they themselves became just as infamous for their brutality. Jack the Ripper had quickly found his stride, putting others of her kind to shame. The man had even tried to court her, to her dismay and disgust. But she was content. She was, dare say, happy with the current arrangement. Until she saw her. Due to her having some of the supreme authority's power, there was a certain level of nigh omniscience. Her kind could gaze upon the earth, the realm of dancing light and darkness, and look upon those that suffered with pain, both physical and mental. It would bring a new type of visceral pleasure to her kind. But the first time she had laid eyes upon her, she knew she couldn't revel in this one's torment. She watched the scene unfold before her. There was the unmistakable sound of a slap, the younger girl's cheek, tinged red where the hand touched skin. "You're a fucking disappointment," the older woman seethed. 14 and still unable to wolf out. There was no sympathy or love in the older woman's eyes as she glared at the blonde on the floor, who had curled up into a ball in an attempt to protect herself from another onslaught. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't wolf out yet, I have tried everything." Her multicolored nails gestured wildly to the numerous books that littered the desk. How to Become One with Your Wolf, A Guide, A Late Bloomer's Story, Where Is Your Werewolf? Amongst many other titles that Wednesday could not see. The mother gazed coldly at the floor. "That makes it worse." The woman spat. The blonde on the floor jumped as the door to her room slammed shut, and her mother's thundering footsteps fell away, leaving the tormented blonde on her own. Well, almost. Wednesday, incorporeal, stood above the blonde, unsure of what to do. This was one of the first few times she had taken this limited form on the earth. She could really do naught but watch the blonde shake with tears. The blonde had finally lifted her face from her protective ball, and Wednesday knew her breath would have hitched in her throat if she could breathe. She was breathtaking. Absolutely breathtaking. Her flushed face only served to highlight the bright blonde hair of the girl, but it was her eyes, a golden blue tinged with a hint of silver. Tears continued to stream down her cheeks, and Wednesday found herself reaching out to try to wipe them away, only for her hand to fade through her. The blonde, none the wiser, turned and climbed onto her bed, hugging a stuffed pigeon plushie to her chest. Her eyes stared at nothing in particular as she tried to mute the feelings within. Wednesday, completely smitten, returned every day to spend time with the Leakin. Watched as her mother continued to abuse her, sometimes with her words and to Wednesday's anger, her fists. At the end of the first month, Wednesday had had enough, and she had never felt so helpless, wanting nothing more than to protect the Leakin, having spent long days by her side, wishing to provide comfort to the one who she couldn't fathom having feelings for before. It came to a head one particular night when the girl, Enid, she had learned her name, had been locked out of her house, thrown out by her mother. Wednesday hadn't caught what happened, but she could guess as Enid took shelter in a shed at the end of the garden, a small corner already adorned with blankets and an air mattress. Obviously this has happened before. It made Wednesday's blood boil to the core to see the abuse, The negligence. It was enough for her to try to speak to him. She stepped away from the shed and felt her fingers curl into fists, as she glared up at the sky. You could stop this if you wanted, couldn't you? She spat out. There was no response. That's if you wanted to, if you were as all-loving as you claimed to be. There was silence, not that she expected any response to begin with, but even so, Wednesday's fury filled her entire being. If you don't do something, then I will, and it will be bloody, she growled out. She knew he heard her words, he always did, but there was still no response. Fine. You leave me no choice. I will do what must be done. Wednesday turned to regard the shed before her, where the wolf lay within, where Enid was staring at the wall, lost in her despair. I'm coming, Mia Lupa, she said softly as her incorporeal body returned to the abyss. Her return started with a search for 2 specific souls. For her plan to work, she would need these 2 for her background to be credible. You too, she hissed. You're coming with me. The 2 souls upped and immediately followed. Hands held together, they were well known throughout the abyss, 2 souls that had not been broken yet by the tortures that had bequeathed them. You are going to help me on Earth, when we reach there, and you will do as I say, she explained as she strapped several dagger-sized blades to her body, one of which was a spring-activated wrist blade. Apologies, Diablo, but what is in it for us? The shorter, stockier man dared to ask. When you get to live again, she scowled. And 2, you won't have to return here after you die, you have my word. The short, stocky man beamed. Gracias, Diablo, we accept your terms. Both souls beamed at her. She rolled her eyes. I lead, you follow, she said as they got closer to the edge of the abyss. The abyss was a realm that was protected, from without and within. There were thousands of monsters between here and the rare portals to Earth, and multiple circles and planes. Hulking abominations eyed her as she strode forwards. The wrist blades sprung forth, and she grinned manically. This is where the fun begins, she muttered before skeletal wings unfurled from behind her back with a crack, spreading to their fullest span and launching herself forward. 1 year, 8 months. That's how long it took for Wednesday to fight through the hordes of abominations. But she did it. The anguish of Enid had spurred her on, even in the darkest times where she thought she would fail. For beings like her were not allowed to leave the abyss. Their kind were known to commit evil deeds once free. Usually the weaker ones got though the easiest. Their spirits found it easier to slip between planes of existence. But she was different. She knew this. A pale, black-nailed hand burst forth from the ground. Dirt gave way as a body dragged itself from the earth. 2 floating orbs close behind her. They floated away, eager to return to their bodies. Wednesday coughed out dirt from her newly formed lungs. She was no stranger to pain, but this felt different on the mortal plane. Pain and injury could cause death. In the abyss it could not. She would have to be careful. Whilst she was immensely durable, she was as mortal as the apes her fallen kin had grown to detest. She took her first steps in this new world. Her powers were limited here. She could still do a few parlor tricks, more than most magically infused mortals could do. But still limited. It wasn't like before when the Watchers came to mate with humans. But she no longer cared. She had something to accomplish. She looked around the clearing, a graveyard. The body she now inhabited had used the decaying flesh, bone and muscle in the ground around her to form herself a body that was to her liking. Almost no other of her kind knew that little spell. Being forced into possessing other. She smirked before striding forwards, watching one hand burst forth just as hers did from the ground. The short, stocky man had broke through the grave first. Dirt had fallen downwards. As he vacated his burial ground, his hand reached down to pull out a slimmer and taller female. Pale as the moon, she gracefully, with her husband's help, found comfort on solid ground once more. "Ah, smell that, cara mia," the man said, taking a great inhale of breath. The woman beside him did the same. "MMHHH, the smell of the decayed?" she asked with a glint in her eyes. "The fragrance pales in comparison to you, mon chéri," he whispered, pulling her hand up to kiss it delicately. Wednesday rolled her eyes and stepped forwards. "What are your names?" she asked. Apologies, Diablo, I am Gomez Adams," Gomez said with a small bow, taking his paramour's hand. "And I am Morticia Adams," she said. "A pleasure." Her smile would send shivers down the spine of most people, but Wednesday was not most people. Wednesday now understood why these two had such a reputation down below. Their souls radiated resilience, strength, and tenacity. She could respect that at the very least, even if their affections were vomit-inducing. "But what about you, Diablo? You never told us your name," Gomez asked hopefully. She thought for a moment. The name given to her by the supreme authority rolled across her tongue, but she decided against it. The less praise he was given, the better. She settled for one. "Call me Wednesday." 16-year-old Enid Sinclair sighed dejectedly. Another year at Nevermore had passed. Another year where she would continue to disappoint her mother. She dove onto her bed and buried her head in her pillow. She hadn't wolfed out, she had good grades at the very least, but it didn't seem to matter to the matriarch of the family. Today was a good day, she had only suffered a verbal assault. She had been stuck downstairs since she had come back from Nevermore. The couch in the living room was right next to the door that led to the stairway. She had been desperate to escape to her room. She had edged forwards nervously, her eyes never leaving the older woman. Only when she had gathered every nerve in her soul she had darted forward, through the doorway. She thanked the moon that her mother hadn't lashed out at her as she passed. Either she was too quick or she simply didn't care. Enid was grateful for the small reprieve, no matter how short. She did conceal it well, though Yoko nor Davinia knew about the true extent of the abuse she had suffered. Most knew it to be verbal, especially on Parents' Weekend, where appearances needed to be maintained. But at home, things were different. And Enid bore the weight of it alone. Tap, 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 tap. Enid lifted her head from the pillow with a frown. Did she just hear that? Her ears wiggled slightly, listening out for the sound again. Tap, 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 tap. It was her window. Enid cautiously made her way to the window, and what she saw confused her. It was a raven. A raven with a gleaming black coat and proudly pruned feathers that seemed to glow, and intense beady black eyes. It started to peck at the window again, almost impatiently. Okay, Jesus," she muttered as she moved the latch of the window and opened it. The black raven turned to regard her and let out a soft caw. "You don't want to come in this house, little guy. It's full of wolves," Enid said sadly to the bird. It tilted its head, like it was questioning her. The bird, however, hopped forward and perched on the windowsill. It let out another soft caw as its head began to regard the colorful room before it. It hopped over the threshold into the room. "No, wait," she sighed. "Well done, Enid, you've officially lost it, talking to a raven," she said, groaning into her hands. "Fine, whatever, welcome to my room, I guess," she finished lamely. The raven let out another softer caw. The bird was now inches from the blonde. She reached out a tentative hand as the raven watched on, curiously. It was well known that both ravens and wolves had a sort of symbiotic relationship. In the wild, ravens would often taunt and tease younger wolf pups in a form of play. Some werewolves had even taken on ravens to become familiars. Maybe that was why this lone raven was here now. She flashed her first genuine smile since she had returned home. Her fingers graced the feather coat of the bird, marveling at how soft and well kept the feathers felt. The raven tilted its head into the wolf's hand, encouraging her to continue. "Well, ain't you friendly?" Enid giggled as she continued to stroke the animal. It thrilled lightly as the blonde continued her ministrations. "A lone wolf and a lone raven." She chuckled at the irony. She knew it was the fate that would befall if she didn't wolf out, and she honestly believed she probably never would. Part of her was okay with that, though. Maybe it was for the best. At least she would be away from her mother. It cawed loudly in warning. Mere seconds afterwards there was banging on her door. "That's the third time I have called you down for dinner," her mother shouted on the other side. Enid gulped. "Better go, little guy," Enid said softly, giving the bird one final stoke, that the bird readily accepted. The bird allowed itself to be nudged back towards the window, and Enid closed it, securing the latch. She gave the bird another small smile before heading downstairs. The raven watched her go before settling down on the window ledge and peering off into the sky. 2 weeks. Enid had noticed the raven would come to her window every day, and it would not leave for hours, she continued, to let the black bird into her room where it would keep her company. Surely ravens didn't behave like this? But for Enid it was nice. The raven would sit and listen as she talked for hours about anything, and it would sit there patiently, letting out soft caws as she spoke. But one evening the bird returned the window to find the blonde was not within, and the raven let out a sad call. But its sharp ears heard the scream of a girl that it knew all too well. Enid was in pain. The raven instantly took flight, and it soared to the other side of the house where the panicked cries came from, landing on a branch of a tree where it could see the events unfold before it. The raven's beady eyes laid forth onto a woman dragging the younger girl by her blonde hair. It watched with boiling blood as this beautiful girl was abused by its own mother. "You're a fucking embarrassment!" Esther screamed. "I told you to stay in your room tonight." Spit flew from Esther's mouth in fury. Enid was in too much agony to respond with naught but pained sobs. Embarrassing our pack in front of the region's alpha. Esther tore open the shed that was Enid's second home at this point and threw the girl inside, who sobbed uncontrollably. Her mother slammed the shed shut and locked it. Enid's cries for forgiveness and love went unheeded. Esther stormed back into the house whilst the raven watched on in a muted kill rage. The back door slammed shut and there was silence, save for the desperate sobs of Enid. The raven took flight again and glided through a small hole in the wall. The raven landed inside gracefully and cawed softly. The heartbroken and abused girl lifted her tear-stained cheeks. Bloodshot eyes met the beady black ones and Enid broke down all over again. The bird hopped over to the girl and nuzzled its beak against the girl's face. Enid gently cupped the raven to her body as she sobbed her heart out, the raven letting out small thrills in comfort. Eventually, the girl had fallen asleep, having cried herself to sleep. The raven hopped away from the sleeping body of Enid. It watched her rising and falling chest for a moment before it bowed its head. There was a cracking of bone and flutter of wings. In place of the raven that Enid had grown so fond of, knelt Wednesday Addams. Her face asunder with fury and hatred. Her head gazed over her shoulder at the house before turning to face the wolf in front of her. She reached out a pale hand and delicately stroked her fingers against the tear stains that adorned her cheeks. "My wolf," Wednesday gently whispered. "What has she done to you?" she uttered with longing. Enid automatically shuffled in her sleep and leaned into the gentle touches. Her soul was touch and love starved. Wednesday reluctantly removed her fingers and let them curl into fists by her side. Her mind was made up. Esther and Murray Sinclair were sleeping soundly. They did not see the shadow that entered their room. Nor did they hear the snap of fingers as Wednesday performed magic, the type that would keep people seduced under the lullaby of sleep and one in particular paralyzed to the bed. Wednesday strode forwards and pulled a knife from within her coat, twirling it into a reverse grip, the blade sharp and deadly. Wednesday savored the moment. She brought the blade down. Straight into Esther Sinclair. In the spot just above the kneecap. Esther woke up screaming. But no one would hear her screams. "Esther Sinclair," Wednesday hissed, letting her magic flow from her. Esther was rooted in place, unable to move, terrified eyes moved up to meet hers. "You have a lot to answer for, Mutt," she growled. "Help! Help!" Her screams were blood-curdling. Wednesday's lips twitched upwards. "No one can help you now, beg all you wish, no one will answer." Wednesday taunted, the hand twisted and the blade tore through flesh as Esther screamed until her vocal cords bled. Wednesday's mouth hung open, as she savored every ounce of agony. "Please! Mercy! Please, I'll do anything!" Esther begged. Wednesday's eyes darkened to the point of where light did not dare attempt to escape. She begged for you, her mother, for mercy, she begged God for mercy. "You dare beg me when you have given no mercy to your own progeny," Wednesday hissed. Esther was reduced to pathetic whimpering as she realized the person in front of her was without mercy. "Fortunately for her, it's not always him that answers the prayers of the suffering, it's the devil's," Wednesday said, looming over the face of Esther. "Please!" Esther begged. Wednesday's mind was cast back to Enid, who practically begged to be loved by her mother, even as she abused her, beat her, neglected her, abandoned her in a fucking shed. A shed where she still lay now. Wednesday so red. Wednesday withdrew the knife and aimed it for the woman's stomach. "Can werewolves bleed out?" Wednesday asked. Esther could only shake her head. Wednesday sneered. "Let's find out, shall we?" Her hand became a blur as she viscously thrust the knife into the matriarch's stomach countless times. Esther could do nothing but choke on her own blood as the blade tore through flesh, muscle, and intestine. Midway through, Wednesday waved her hand and Esther's vocal cords were violently severed, unable to verbalize her tortured agony any longer. Wednesday couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Her anger could not abet it, could not be sated. "I'm going to make you suffer the most exquisite of agonies." Wednesday spat at the werewolf, who was currently choking on their own blood, unable to die as silver was not the instrument being used to inflict the wounds. "You!" Stab. "Fucking!" Stab. "Hurt!" Stab. "Her!" Wednesday's bangs flopped down into her face. Her chest heaving with unrestrained anger and rage, she grappled Esther by the collar and launched the detestable woman away from her. Straight through the 3-story high window. Her body tumbled out of sight. Wednesday growled and moved towards it, letting herself fall through it. Esther, no longer bound by Wednesday's paralyzing magic, tried to crawl away. Her broken body would not allow her to move too far. The terrified woman could only watch as Wednesday floated down from the top window. Magnificat raven-shaped wings beating against the air. There was a crack as her wings folded back into her body. Wednesday strode up to the broken woman and kneeled down. "The only reason you aren't dead is because she is pure and good and precious, everything that I am not, and I won't defile that with your death. Consider this mercy." Esther could only pathetically nod rapidly. "Abuse her again, and I will drag you to the pit myself." Wednesday sneered. Her fist came snapping down on Esther, knocking her out. Wednesday sighed and got to work. The message was now well received, and she set about clearing up the mess. Magic was so useful in this regard. Repairing the window, removing all traces of blood and debris, and reluctantly healing Esther of her wounds. If only for Enid's sake. But there were other ways to inflict misery and pain. Wednesday withdrew her magics, allowing the Sinclair clan to resume their regular slumbering. Before Wednesday turned her eyes back towards the shed, there was one more thing she needed to do. When Enid awoke the next day, she was flabbergasted to find herself tucked up in her room, in bed. Her pigeon plushie tucked underneath her left arm, and was something that definitely wasn't there before. A raven plushie was sat at the end of her bed by her feet. Enid half gasped and half squealed at seeing it, and launched herself across her bed in order to pick it up and hug it to her chest. A proper heart-warming smile graced her. The raven sat perched on the windowsill and watched over the wolf that she swore to protect. A being that would relish in the torture and terror of others. But never her. Never her. She would do it all for her. Esther Sinclair would wake up in abject fear, remembering every ounce of torment, body stricken with sobs, as Murray Sinclair, confusedly, comforted his wife, unaware of the ordeal she had gone through the night before. Neither of them noticed the raven's soulless black eyes watching them. Until Esther's met the raven's. Her body shook in horror. And the raven's face contorted and shifted, never losing eye contact. It grinned maliciously.